Welcome to Chicko's Video Dustbin Show. Today's episode is Track of the Moon Beast, directed by Dick Ashe and co-written by comic book writer Bill Finger. The movie begins with a meteor heading towards the sun, which looks more like a roasted marshmallow being waved in front of a headlight as a shaman sings and dances in the dark. This celestial event causes the local news to issue a special report. It's like nobody ever was seen a meteor shower before. The next day, we saw our protagonist of the film, Paul, a trust fund baby and student mineralogist/archaeologist farting around the New Mexican desert. Good news, ladies, Paul spends a lot of screen time with his shirt off. Paul is surprised by his old professor, John Salinas, a.k.a. Johnny Longbow. Funny, he doesn't look Welsh. Along with him are his annoying students and a photographer named Kathy. We get another special report about a lunar meteor shower while the gang eats some of Professor John's family soup. John describes the ingredients of the family soup, which makes it sound like it's either succotash, gumbo, jailhouse slop, or some crap you just toss into a pot. Paul makes the moves on Kathy and tells her of a special place they can watch the meteor shower and leaves while Professor John lays some more native wisdom upon his pupils. Paul and Kathy watch the meteor shower while spewing mundane dialogue, while a few miles away, John and company are doing the very same thing. Paul notices something spiraling towards him at a jillion miles an hour and blocks Kathy while taking the blow. The object was a meteorite, a space rock, and it leaves a gash on his head that looks like he bladed himself during an indie wrestling match. He spots the glowing rock and takes it with him, but the tissue that Kathy used to stop the bleeding also glows as well. Paul takes Kathy home to his mom's house, and she thinks she's going to get some until she bumps into his roommate, Ty. Two is company, but three's a crowd, and this immediately turns her off. Paul tries to warm her up, but it's too late, and she bids adieu, while disappointed Ty thought he was either going to be a voyeur like Andy Warhol or participate in some of the loving. The next day, Kathy and Paul go to a rock show at the university, but when she takes a picture of him looking at the moon rock display, it causes a chain reaction when the flash from the light bounces off the rock and triggered the one in his head, making him all woozy and shit. Paul, John, and Kathy go on a date to watch the Mama and Papa, and gets the same reaction I would have watching this half-baked country rock folk music. All that awful 70s dirt weed secondhand smoke would give anybody a migraine. John and Kathy take Paul home and tuck him into bed. The night is still young, though, and Kathy's going to find out why the professor's nickname is Longbow, even though he's not Welsh. A full moon rises, and it gets Paul and Ty all hot and bothered. Paul gets up, sounding like a bull in heat, grabs the moon rock, goes up to Ty's cage, holds it up to the moon, and all three become an unholy trinity of homicidal lunar horror. Believe me, folks, it sounds so much better than it really is. Later that night, a drunk league bowler comes home staggering after rolling all gutters and losing his team's place in the standings, while his wife is inside laying on the couch getting drunk, just waiting for him to come inside so she can berate him. While he's banging on the door trying to get inside, she tells him not to come home drinking with lovin' on his mind, but he encounters something outside that's hot and heavy, but it's not his wife, and he screams in horror. The wife soon hears what sounds like a giant monster murdering her husband, opens the front door, only to find her husband falling inside with his face looking like a big pile of hamburger helper. The local police department are flummoxed by the gruesome murder of a local league bowler and a massive heart attack that his portly wife suffered, so they call the services Professor John. The only clues the murderer left was a big giant bloody handprint and a strange footprint outside the victim's house. The next morning, Kathy goes to Paul's house, only to find him naked on his bed. Kathy screams in horror as she notices that Ty's cage has been ripped open. John and the police captain visit a professor of dinosaur studies, and he says the murderer is either a giant monitor lizard or a Tyrannosaurus rex, so the Triceratops and the Stegosaurus were ruled out as suspects. John, Paul, and Kathy hang out at a local archery range. John demonstrates why they call him the Red Arrow, but Paul has another episode which includes a bit of foreshadowing. Kathy tells Paul that she's going to take good care of him, so she drives him back to his house, tucks him into bed, and hangs out in his playroom while he rests. The full moon rises and Paul becomes all hot and bothered, so he gets out of bed, sneaks past a sleeping Kathy, and goes outside for some fresh air. Some old dudes are just hanging out in the New Mexican desert, drinking, shooting the breeze, and playing cards when all of a sudden something hot heavy and angry, crashes the party and slaughters them all. Kathy finds a naked Paul in the pool room, and she tells him that he really needs to see a doctor. The captain tells John that the dinosaur has killed 3 more people, and they just don't have the budget to afford the services of Turok, so they'll have to find another solution. Paul finally gets some x-rays of his head, and they notice that he has a piece of moon rock lodged into his brain. John shows the police captain some slides that tells some cock and bull story about a space rock that caused a man to become a lizard creature that kills several people before it's destroyed by a ray of light. This so-called Navajo legend is just the plot of this movie written out by a hack pulp comic book writer. John demonstrates to the captain that the space rock in Paul's head is connected to the one in the middle room, and it's the cause of Paul turning into a monster, which befuddles the police captain because his theory that a dinosaur was murdering people is tossed out, and they're now mixed up with some weird lizard wolfman. The duo tells Paul that he's a lizard monster, and they have to keep him in observation while Kathy can't believe the news that she just heard. So they keep him locked up overnight and watch him transform into the monster. Paul freaks out when they tell him that he's the monster and that he murdered 4 people and gave an overweight woman a heart attack. The government gets wind of this, and they send a scientist and a neurosurgeon to study Paul's case. They come in and tell Paul they're going to help him, but the new x-rays of his brain shows that the rock has dissipated and spread throughout his body, turning him into a biological ticking time bomb that will explode during the next transformation. Paul freaks out when he eavesdrops on the doctor's conversation, so he says goodbye to Kathy and sneaks out of the hospital because he wants to die as a man, not as a monster. Kathy tells him that Paul ran off to die in the wild like an old house cat. Paul tries to buy a shotgun and go out like Jordy Verrill, but the police pull an APB out on him, which scares him despite the gun shop owner wanting a huge sale. John and the cop are confused to where Paul is, but Kathy gets one single thought in her head, and it's about Paul talking about his favorite chill spot. Paul tries to kill himself in a motorcycle accident and later jumps from a gondola, but he just can't die. Kathy later finds him, but he tells her to leave before the full moon rises. Hours later, Kathy is still trying to get Paul to come back, but she gets stuck in a crevice. Paul's still trying to ditch her, but the moon rises and he turns into the monster. Her wild screams get the attention of 2 cops that were following her, and they begin to shoot wildly in the air, but the monster sneaks up from behind and gives them the old Three Stooges noggin knock. The gang finds Kathy and the dead cops. John decides to end all this nonsense and pulls out his bow with the moon rock arrowhead. John shoots the monster, and we're treated to an awesome light show before the creature disappears into a neon glowing stain. The end. Good lord, this movie was a chore to sit through. The acting was bad, Paul was a vacuum of charisma, and an even worse actor. John had to overact to compensate for it, and the actress that played Kathy was the worst. She couldn't even get an acting role in a 6th grade play. Her performance reminded me of Zooey Deschanel singing on stage live with her band She and Him. Is this stage fright, or she just can't act at all? The Lizard Man genre didn't find any fans in horror films, except on DeviantArt or as a transformation fetish, so we won't see any romance novels like the ones that Wolfie gets. John Landis really liked this one because he used some of its elements in his American Werewolf in London movie. He even took one of the special effects artists, Rick Baker, who helped design the monster costume and gore effects that were edited out of this print because the one I reviewed was the TV version. Thanks for watching, folks, and I'll see you next time at the video shop, YouTube, or some other streaming service. Goodbye.